I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. And at this point in the semester, I want to give you some real encouragement. We're about halfway through now, and we've worked on critical skills. So far this semester, we've worked on survey, and we've worked on making observations and asking lots of questions, right? We've made observations. So we worked on detailed observation. Both of these are types of what we would say, again, observe, right? And we're asking questions. And so far this term, it's felt a little mechanical because we haven't tried to answer any questions. We've done two types of observations: broad survey, which allows us kind of to look down on a map looking for major structures. And we've asked questions of our structures and found strategic areas. Now, if you haven't put that together yet, the strategic areas, those are critical because they give us the jumping off places for where we can begin to do our interpretive work. And if you've noticed, when I've had you do a detailed observation, so like we started with, say, 417 to 20, but on a previous assignment, we've just worked on 517 to 48, and we did detailed analysis or observation on 546 to 48. And if you did your survey on that whole thing, what did we look at? We basically did some observation on what the climax. Also, there was a causation built in there, and so we picked a smaller portion to make dynamic observations of, and then we asked even more questions. So you can do interpretation two different ways. You can simply start with your survey, pick the structure that you think is the most comprehensive or takes into account most of the material, and begin by interpreting the strategic area. And you can just take one of your structure questions, probably your definitional question, and try to answer that question just out with the strategic area and make that your immediate context. You could also start an interpretation with a detailed observation. So we're going to do that a couple of different ways as we move through the rest of the semester. But these are your critical skills. Because you haven't figured it out yet, the purpose of this class is to empower you to be able to dig into a text on your own without needing to immediately just look at commentaries, which we will look at, or articles, or even to go outside of the book that you're working in to other parts of the Bible. Again, I know the temptation still is when you're studying is you want to bring in what Paul says or what John says or what something in the Old Testament says, but you don't do that at this point. We're focusing on hearing what Matthew is trying to communicate. So be encouraged. It's always correct to go back into Matthew and to pull even more data out of the context. I'll say that more about that in just a minute. Okay, so be encouraged. We've learned the skills. The last thing that we're going to add this semester is going to be interpretation, which is simply going to be what? Answering interpretive questions, and you're working on that right now, right? And so you start with a question, and then you go to the context first of all to answer your question, and you're going to make observations. And now instead of asking more questions, you draw inferences. So I observe that, and you can make a couple of observations. You know, sometimes every observation will have an inference. Sometimes you need to make a couple of observations before you draw an inference, and you can make multiple inferences off the data. But you want to make inferences like this suggests and begin to draw conclusions that your evidence supports. That's the critical thing. And so you want to begin to answer your interpretive questions with the context. And so again, context, and I'll say this over and over again, it's three levels for our course. It's immediate. That's the smaller portion that we're working on. So like if you're working on 9:35 to 11:1 this week, I'm having you do an interpretation of compassion, and so that immediate context is going to be 9:35 to 38, right? Then there's the segment, which is the larger block, approximately chapter, that your immediate context is in. So for 9:35 to 11:1, that's the segment. And then you also want to think about broader book. Where else in Matthew's gospel can you get insights? Okay, so context, that's a critical piece. You're always going to want to do a deep dive here, and the bulk of your work on interpretive assignments should be dynamic, powerful, a rich, careful, close reading of the text, starting with immediate, and then some segment, and then some broader book. But this will be the biggest one. So context is always going to be your most important determinant. Okay, don't be content with superficiality. If you literally have your interpretation done in a page, you're not working hard enough. Okay, it needs to be a real deep dive. I'm not going to give you a word counts or pages, but you really need to put the time in. If anybody can look at the text and come up with what you came up with, I mean, that's not graduate level biblical interpretation. That's not even good enough for a sermon. So you want to do a deep dive and be empowered. You all can dig into the text. Put the time in. You're going to be super happy with the skills that you get this semester. And actually, most importantly, is who's really going to be happy? The people that listen to you preach or teach or counsel with the scriptures, because you're going to be a person who's been a workman who's been approved by God because you've learned some real skills. Don't be content with superficiality. You don't deserve it. And even more importantly, the people that you serve. So you're going to have your diploma up there. It's going to say Master of Divinity or Master of Mental Health Counseling or Master of Ministry, whatever you have. The people see that master's degree. It needs to mean something. So learn to do a deep dive into the scriptures. That's what Asbury is all about. We're the whole Bible for the whole world. So love the people that you're going to serve enough to push yourself to get really good at this. Okay, make sure that when you're working that you're citing most of your work from the context. Don't worry about being wrong. Okay, let me say it again. Don't worry about being wrong. The evidence will correct things. Don't worry about making Matthew say what you think Paul says or John says or what you think your own theology is. Let Matthew say whatever Matthew was trying to say under God's inspiration, and then through the process we work in other insights. But don't try to smooth over the Bible like you're fixing a crack on a cake with frosting and frosting over cracks. Let Matthew say whatever Matthew wants to say, and we'll figure out the broader meanings and how that fits in with the rest of the scriptures later. Our job isn't to harmonize in this class. It's to let the scriptures sing. Scripture's like a choir. If you're a tenor, you don't make a tenor a bass. You don't make a tenor a baritone. You don't make a tenor a soprano. Everybody has their own parts. So John may be a soprano on one thing and Matthew may be the bass. You're going to misread Matthew if you make the bass sound like a soprano. Does that make sense? So let Matthew say what Matthew wants to say. That's what we're working on in this class. So don't worry about harmonizing and don't worry about making mistakes. Inductive Bible Study is self-correcting, so just always cite evidence. Let the evidence go wherever it needs to go. Think about like a CSI episode. I couldn't remember what that TV show was called. The crime scene investigators. They always follow the evidence. So it's like we're like detectives in this. We're scriptural detectives. So just let the evidence go where it is, and be encouraged. Just put the time in, do your work, and you'll be happy with where you end up. I just wanted to encourage you. Again, we're about halfway through the semester now, maybe a little bit more than that. The rest of the semester, we're going to be synthesizing the skills that you've learned in survey, and we're going to be adding this interpretation piece to it. And you're going to be working on mostly survey and some interpretation assignments individually. Then we're going to have a couple of assignments when you do the whole process. Looking forward to getting your work. If I can help you in any way, just reach out to me. It's a real privilege to be your professor this semester. I'm Brian Russell, and I'll see you next time.